Nickelodeon has given us so many beloved shows over the years. I want to shine a spotlight on one of my all-time favorites, the children's horror anthology, Are You Afraid of the Dark? Every episode, the Midnight Society would gather around the campfire to tell scary stories, and we, the young audience, would try to make it all the way to the end, no matter how spooky things got. For the month of October, over the span of 3 videos, I want to count down my top 31 favorite episodes of this show. Not necessarily the scariest episodes, just ones that I personally love the most. The ones that left an impact on me as a kid, and the ones that still hold up today as being effective. I know not everyone is going to agree with my choices, but hey, that's the internet for you. Oh, fair warning, there will be plenty of spoilers ahead. Submitted for the approval of my wonderful viewers, I call this video My Top 31 Are You Afraid of the Dark Episodes, Part 1. Number 31. The Chameleons. The first episode we're covering is sort of a riff on Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Janice, played by guest star Tia Mowry, is in a pet store where a creepy kid goads her into touching a chameleon. When she does, it bites her, and the kid recites a poem that fans of the series will probably remember pretty well. Bite you once, bite you twice, a little water, pay the price. When an unnerved Janice heads home, the chameleon that bit her manages to follow her and bites her again that night. It turns into a copy of her, played by Tia's sister, Tamara. The chameleon clone splashes water on Janice, turning her into a chameleon herself. The story then follows Janice's friend Sharon, who suspects something is up with her friend, and begins to realize that this Janice is an imposter, who wants to help replace everyone she can with a chameleon. It comes to a point where she has a box of chameleons delivered from the pet store. At the climax, Janice as a chameleon manages to bite her imposter, allowing her to turn back into a human. But that leaves us with 2 Janices, both who are now susceptible to water. In a classic bit, Sharon must figure out who is the real Janice and spray the other one with a hose. One of the Janices throws the box of chameleons down the well, something an evil reptile shapeshifter would never do to their brethren. Sharon sprays the imposter, turning her back into a chameleon, and down she goes with the others. Good has triumphed over evil. Except, no. That night, Janice creeps out to the well and recovers the chameleons in the box, apologizing for her earlier actions. She had to convince Sharon somehow, after all. The imposter walks off with her scaly family, leaving the real Janice to drown in the well. Unlike Goosebumps, which aired around the same time and almost always had a dark twist ending to its stories, Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes tended to end in the protagonist's favor, at least a little more than half the time. Seeing Janice get such a cruel fate was jarring for me as a kid. I'd seen the classic "I'm the real one, no me" trope done before, but if the person chose wrong, it was usually played as a joke rather than a dramatic twist. This was the first time I'd seen something like this happen. In addition to the story's Body Snatchers inspiration, it also reminds me of that supernatural conspiracy theory that reptilian people have infiltrated the government. It adds a fun layer of weirdness to the story. My question is, can the chameleon Janice ever get wet again, or would that turn her back into a lizard? That's gonna pose a challenge in the near future. Also, apparently the lizards used in this episode were not chameleons, but rather iguanas. I assume they wanted to use chameleons since they are characterized by their ability to blend into different environments. Perhaps iguanas were just easier to train. The episode has a rather slow beginning, but once the chameleon transforms, things really pick up. I think that if this episode had a happy ending, it still would have been very passable. Still a good one, but I don't think it would have made my list. But that twist ending really cemented it as a classic Are You Afraid of the Dark entry. Number 30. The Midnight Ride. Next up is another episode where the first half is so-so, but the second half really delivers. This one is based on the classic short story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, and takes place in the titular town in the 90s. The story of Ichabod Crane and his encounter with the Headless Horseman is a well-known one, and if you've seen the Disney cartoon, you have a good idea of how it goes. It's a remarkably faithful adaptation. But if you don't know that story, it's about a new school teacher, Ichabod, who falls in love with the beautiful Katrina. Supposedly, there is a ghostly horseman who prowls through the woods at night, looking for his head, or whoever else's head he can take instead. One night, on the way back from a Halloween party, Ichabod encounters the ghost and is chased down. His true fate is uncertain, but it's heavily implied that the horseman was actually his romantic rival, Brom Bones, in disguise, and Ichabod merely fled town afterward. Awkward but well-meaning Ian is new to Sleepy Hollow, and finds himself unwittingly reenacting the legend, along with a few other students, with him as Ichabod, Katie as his love interest, and Brad as Brom Bones. It's the night of the Halloween dance, and Brad is determined to keep Ian away from Katie. He puts Ian through an initiation where Ian is sent into the woods to retrieve a pumpkin that represents the horseman's missing head. It's from Brad that we learn, in their retelling of the legend, Ichabod's big mistake was taking the wrong path through the woods that caused him to get killed by the horseman. No ambiguity on Ichabod's fate this time. Supposedly, the famous chase is reenacted by the ghosts on Halloween night. Although Ian is ultimately pranked and humiliated by Brad, he ends up growing closer to Katie as a result. As they head home, they encounter the ghost of Ichabod, who is trying to figure out which path to take. Ian gives him the correct directions, but in doing so, changes the story. Now Ian and Katie are the horseman's targets, leading to their own ghostly chase through the woods to escape the Phantom. As I said, the first half of this episode is mostly setup. The high school romance with the dweeby protagonist and the bully jock is a familiar one, and I'll admit that I was more caught up in the story as a kid when I was focused on how fun and novel a modern take on the Sleepy Hollow story was. Today I had more of a, okay, we've seen this whole bit before, get to the ghosts kind of attitude. But once the ghosts show up, I'm still as invested today as I was when I was a kid. The ghost of Ichabod is done very well. He's eerie and off-putting, but still a pleasant fellow. The Headless Horseman is appropriately scary, and I still remember being in awe at his big entrance when I first watched this episode. We see his shadow cast on the school's wall, but the source of the shadow is nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, the horseman rides out of the shadow with a frowning jack-o'-lantern mounted on his shoulders. Like a lot of effects on the show, it's pretty cheesy today, but whenever I watch that moment, I'm a kid again. I think it was this moment specifically that earned this episode a place on the list. I also feel the need to mention the actor who played Ichabod's ghost, Arthur Holden, is the voice of Mr. Ratburn on Arthur. There are quite a few actors from cartoons like Arthur or The Magic School Bus who are on the show, and I'll try to mention them when I can on their episodes. Because they're narrators rather than a character on the stories, I will mention right now that Kiki, Jodie Rethner, is the longtime voice of Francine Frensky, and Tucker, Daniel DeSanto, is the voice of Carlos. Number 29. Bigfoot Ridge. Are You Afraid of the Dark originally ran for 5 seasons with 65 episodes. This was the requisite for syndication, and many shows around this time, especially ones aimed at a younger audience, ran for about this length. The show ended its original run in 1996, but was brought back for an additional 2 seasons in 1999. As a kid, I typically watched the daytime reruns from the first 5 seasons, but I don't remember seeing many of the newer episodes mixed in with the reruns, perhaps because they were airing during the primetime Snick block instead. As a result, only 2 of the season 6 and 7 episodes will be on this list, as a lot of episodes are on here as a general mix of how I felt about them as a kid and how I feel they hold up today. This is one that I didn't see as a kid at all, actually. It focuses on a trio of kids who are into snowboarding, since this was around the time when extreme sports were the big fad. The rocket power era, if you will. Danny has been very depressed lately since her friend Gina has gone missing on the slopes, and people are starting to give up on ever finding her. Danny believes she's still out there, having caught glimpses of her in crowds. Her brother, Kirk, wants Danny to be able to accept that her friend isn't coming back. But after Danny sees another vision of Gina calling out to her, this time in one of their old home movies, she heads out to find her friend once and for all, with the reluctant Kirk following her. As the sun is setting, Danny spies Gina skiing off into the woods. She follows her friend to an old cabin. She and Kirk find an old woman in the cabin who claims to be Gina. She is the victim of a creature called an Umbra, who lures victims to its lair, drains their life, and uses their form to lure more victims. The weather outside has gotten bad. Danny, Kirk, and Gina are all trapped in the cabin and must survive the night with the Umbra. I love the premise here. They're at the mercy of this monster in a small, enclosed space with nowhere to run. Gina's about to die, with the Umbra sapping the life out of her. The Umbra's only weakness is light, but twiddle-dee-dee, they're running out of batteries for their flashlight. It's a very tense episode. There are, of course, a few plot holes you'll have to look past, but this is commonplace in shows like this. As creepy as the Umbra is, I can't quite figure out how its powers work. It's weak to light, even a flashlight, but appears as Gina twice in pretty well-lit areas. I also can't figure out how it was able to magically possess a VHS tape to help lure Danny into the woods, which are miles away. How far does the Umbra's influence spread? My other, more minor nitpick is the episode's misleading title. This episode has nothing to do with the legendary cryptid Bigfoot. It's merely the name of the snowboarding area. Given the show's focus on the supernatural, I don't see why they put Bigfoot in the title at all. It was a weird choice. And of course, I have to mention that yes, Kirk is played by Hayden Christensen, who is best known as Anakin Skywalker in the Star Wars prequels. I also found that Gina's actress, Sarah Edmondson, has had a very nice voice acting career since this episode, which is funny considering that most of her screen time is as the menacing Umbra, who rarely actually speaks. Go figure. Number 28. The Fire Ghost. This story takes place in a fire station on one of those classic dark and stormy nights. Siblings Jimmy and Roxy are celebrating their firefighting father's birthday, along with the rest of the crew and their mother. It's noted that the parents are divorced, although they get along pretty well platonically. Jimmy is still unhappy with the divorce, and spends a lot of time brooding, trying to figure out who's to blame for the whole thing, so he can have someone to direct his anger at. A fire breaks out nearby, and, as firefighters do, they all head out to take care of things. The kid's mother is called to the hospital around the same time, leaving them alone in the fire station. As it turns out, the station is haunted by not one but two ghosts. One is Jake, a former firefighter who worked alongside the kid's father. The other is the evil fire ghost, who is literally the ghost of a fire that was put out by the rescuers. Jake warns the kids not to look directly into a flame for too long, because that is what will ultimately release the fire ghost into our world. Well, of course, Jimmy does just that, and now Jake and the kids have to deal with a ghost bent on avenging his own death and the death of all his fire brethren. And the children of the man who killed him are just perfect for his first victims. This episode's biggest strength is its tense atmosphere. The dark, empty building is a great setting for a ghost story. The who do you trust theme is well done too, since it's unclear at first whether or not Jake is a friend to the kids. The fire ghost is able to convincingly disguise himself as a creepy police officer at one point as well. He's effectively creepy in general, actually. When he tells Jimmy that he's the son of a murderer, you can really feel the hate behind his words, but also the glee he's expressing at being able to kill this child. You can't reason with him. He's not human, he never was, and he does not operate by our morals. The episode's flaws lie in certain story choices. For instance, I think a different firefighter, maybe even the father, should have told Jimmy and Roxy the legend of the fire ghost rather than Jake. If you tell a kid not to do something, they're probably going to do it. It's how kids are. Jake, being a ghost himself, should know better than anyone how real and dangerous the fire ghost is. So him basically outlining how to release one to an impressionable child comes off as a really dumb move. I'm on the fence about the moral of this episode, about how sometimes bad things happen and there's no one to blame. Jimmy, as I mentioned, feels this way about his parents' divorce, and Jake relates a story to him about how he died while putting out a fire, and how Jimmy's father blamed himself for the accident, despite it not really being anyone's fault. It's a good lesson for the kids watching the episode, but I don't know if it worked within the confines of this particular story. Regardless, the fire ghost himself is a great villain, and I think it's his presence and the story's setting that really carries most of the episode. I wonder how many kids were afraid to look at a candle or fireplace after this one. Number 27. The Gruesome Gourmets. This episode is probably the most unconventional pick for the list. It's about two brothers, David and Tommy, who are suspicious that a pair of eccentric tenants who moved in upstairs are actually cannibals. They notice that when the tenants are interviewing potential housekeepers, they turn away the thinner ones, but take a certain interest in the ones who, to put it kindly, are on the larger side, and then those candidates are never seen leaving. This, along with other circumstantial evidence, begins to make the brothers more and more paranoid about their new neighbors. It all has a very Rear Window feel. I'm probably making this episode sound darker than it actually is. Despite the idea of a killer next door being a classic horror trope, this episode does not play anything remotely seriously. The tenants, Mr. Pym and Mr. Collins, are so exuberant and flamboyant in everything they do that they absolutely steal the show. Look, I'll say it. These two are most definitely in a relationship, and you can tell how much they genuinely enjoy each other's company. Cannibals or not, they're an absolute delight. Everything about this episode radiates silliness, with most of the actors seemingly trying to one-up each other on the zany factor. In addition to the gruesome gourmets, the brothers also have to deal with their babysitter's nasty boyfriend Chuck, who is the living embodiment of, what does she see in this guy? Chuck, along with a rather shrill housekeeper the tense interview, just add to the scenery chewing. This is not a scary episode. In fact, aside from a few rather dull entries in the series, like C7, which was about a haunted jukebox, this might be one of the least scary episodes in the whole show. There's a brief, genuinely creepy nightmare sequence about halfway through, but that's really it. In fact, to lessen the scare factor even further, the ending reveals that it was all just a wacky misunderstanding. Or was it? This was one of the few seasons 6 and 7 episodes that I actually caught as a kid, and I remember not caring for it that much. It wasn't scary, but it was rather off-putting and weird. I didn't really know what to make of it. Now that I'm watching it again as an adult, it's like I suddenly get it. I love it because it's so off-putting and weird. It's really hard not to smile at the wackiness that these two potential cannibals bring to the table. Don't expect any scares this time, expect fun. I've spoken pretty highly of the broad performances by the whole cast here, but if you're going to watch it for anyone, watch it for Mr. Pym and Mr. Collins. Number 26, The Vacant Lot. With the first two entries on this list, The Chameleons and The Midnight Ride, I stated that I greatly preferred the second halves of the episodes, where the action really picked up. That's pretty typical for episodes in any anthology series, since the cast is not recurring. You have a limited time to get to know the characters as the story unfolds, because if you don't care about them, you won't care about the story. It's difficult to balance exposition with the rest of the story in this constrained time frame. I completely understand that. But the funny thing about this episode is that I actually prefer the setup to the execution. Catherine is an insecure girl who, like many teenagers, feels inferior to her peers. One day, after doing poorly at a track meet, she finds herself drawn to a mysterious tented shop that has popped up in a previously vacant lot. The proprietor is a veiled woman named Marie, who offers Catherine a pair of shoes to help her run faster. For payment, she eyes Catherine's ring that was given to her by her grandfather. Catherine is reluctant to part with something that means so much to her, so Marie offers instead to take something that has no value to her. Marie laughs, the shop vanishes, and Catherine is left with the shoes. At this point, the average person, insecure teen or not, would probably piss their pants, burn the shoes, and avoid that vacant lot like the plague from then on. But our protagonist has apparently never heard of Faust or even the concept of a deal with the devil, and not only uses the shoes, but returns to the rematerialized shop later on and grabs a bunch of stuff for a totally 90s makeover. Of course, the price is pieces of her soul and humanity, and she soon begins to snap at people close to her for no reason. Not only that, but she gets a face full of warts and blemishes. I hesitate to use the old insult pizza face, but it's really hard not to, which Marie was apparently afflicted with before, underneath her veil. Now Marie is free of her own previous curse, and she is targeting Catherine's sister, Joyce. In addition to saving her sister, Catherine has to figure out how to regain her humanity and smooth complexion. Like I said, I love the build-up in this episode. The scenes at Marie's shop are very surreal and dreamlike. Our warning bells are going off, and we watch as Catherine makes some pretty awful choices that, perhaps to a vulnerable youth, might have felt right at the time. For as much as I poke fun at Catherine's sheer inability to see that this is magic best left untouched, we've all done stupid stuff, especially when we were younger, without thinking much about any consequences. Once Catherine has gone farther to the dark side, the plot starts to fall apart. Before she gets a face full of mushroom soup, she begins seeing little blemishes here and there. While she's checking herself out in the school bathroom, Marie just kind of strolls out from a stall and reveals her face for the first time, saying she was once just like Catherine. Previously, she alluded to knowing how Catherine felt, and this is the point where Catherine, careless teen or not, should know exactly how things will play out if she keeps going to that shop. This mysterious woman has totally played her hand too soon. But it gets sloppier. Marie offers Catherine some tickets to a concert for her and some cute boy she likes. Catherine, too afraid to look ugly in the face, refuses the tickets. However, they materialize in her hands afterwards. I guess the assumption is that this is one final push from Marie, and if Catherine had just thrown the tickets away or something, then it wouldn't count as a bargain. But Catherine uses them, leading to her getting Marie's curse. It's not totally clear. I remember being pretty spooked by the whole thing as a kid. The makeup effects are pretty hokey today, but I was incredibly frightened the first time I saw them. The relationship between Catherine and Joyce is sweet, and Marie is a fun villain, even when her last couple of scenes don't make a lot of sense. Although she is ultimately defeated by the power of love, or selflessness, or something along those lines, I don't think there's anything stopping her from setting up shop in another town nearby and conning some other kid. Given how rough high school can be for most teens, I have a hard time believing that Marie will have to deal with her facial condition for much longer. Number 25. The Quicksilver. A lot of the staying power of Are You Afraid of the Dark comes from the fact that it not only scared us as kids, but there are times when its scary scenes actually hold up today. This episode's antagonist, credited as Zombie, but referred to in the episode as a creature of darkness, is still pretty terrifying. After an intense prologue where a young girl tries to trap the spirit and perishes in a fire, we meet a family moving into their new house. The focus is on the brothers, Aaron and Doug. Doug very quickly gets sick, and to make matters worse, the boys come face to face with the creature. Aaron learns from a girl at school, Connie, that she used to live in the house until her twin sister Laura died there one night. Turns out, Laura was the one we saw in the prologue. She claimed that a restless spirit was living in their walls and was making her sick. Now, unless Aaron and Connie act fast, Doug will be the creature's next victim. This episode had some very real drama, which is evident from the opening scene where Laura dies in a botched ritual. The relationship between the brothers is very nice and realistic. They get on each other's nerves, but there's also a very strong bond. The bond between Connie and Laura, even after death, is also heartwarmingly evident. It's impressive given they're both being played by the same actress, Tatiana Ali of the Fresh Prince fame. If you're wondering what the title means, the Quicksilver is not the creature of darkness, but a second ghost haunting the house. This is Laura, who has taken the form of a friendly poltergeist. This ghost is brought to you by the letter Q. She has a tendency to leave her mark this way, like a supernatural Zorro. I think this episode showcases a lot of the show's strengths. Sympathetic, likable characters, stakes that are pretty high for a kids' show, and some very effective scares. I'll say it again. The creature of darkness is terrifying, especially the scenes where he emerges from the shadows. I don't know if I'll ever get over how unnerved he makes me. Oh, and as long as I'm pointing out voice actors, Doug's actor, Stuart Stone, was Ralphie in the Magic School Bus. Hopefully Miss Frizzle will do a lesson on demonology one of these days, because her students clearly need it. Number 24. The Twisted Claw. This was the first episode to air on Nickelodeon, appropriately as a Halloween special. It's a variation on the classic Monkey's Paw short story by W.W. Jacobs, where a magical item grants wishes, only for the wishes to have a dark, unpleasant twist. Our protagonists, Kevin and Dougie, obtain the claw on Halloween night when they receive it from a creepy old lady, Miss Clove. This is despite the fact that they pranked her the night before. Of course, Miss Clove has it out for them, and the claw brings the boys nothing but trouble. A wish to win a race, for example, ends up injuring the boys' competitor, instead of bringing actual skill. Kevin is definitely the more reckless of the two boys. He's the one who pranks Miss Clove in the first place, then suggests going back to her house to trick-or-treat the next night. He shows no real concern for his injured track competitor, he keeps pestering Dougie with the claw, and worst of all, he makes an offhand wish/remark about Dougie's parents that leads to them seemingly dying in a car accident off-screen. Yikes. In fact, I'd say Kevin's general callousness is the most unsettling part of this episode today. Don't get me wrong, there are some classic scares to be seen as well. A group of masked teenagers who harass the kids early on are creepy in a fun, cheesy sort of way. The way they each mug for the camera is great, not to mention their weirdly stilted line readings coupled with unnaturally echoing voices. It helps to suggest that these punks were actually conjured up by the claw itself. Later, in a part almost directly lifted from the Monkey's Paw story, a distressed Dougie wishes his grandpa could be there to help him. Problem is, his grandpa's dead, and an unseen, moaning ghost version of Gramps is heading toward their door. The scene with the ghost, not to mention the unseen deaths of Dougie's parents, helps remind the audience that sometimes the most disturbing material is the stuff you don't get to actually see. Of course, the final wish made on the claw is the wishing none of this ever happened one, which banishes the ghost and saves Dougie's parents, who arrive a second later perfectly fine. I've gotta say, I admire Are You Afraid of the Dark for being able to give episodes a happy ending that doesn't make any of the preceding events any less scary. Speaking of preceding events, I also have to mention this episode's prologue, an unfinished ghost story about a kid being menaced by a hooded figure in his bedroom. This is some classic nightmare material, and it's worth watching for that opening scene alone, despite it only being about 30 seconds long. Number 23. The Unfinished Painting. This is another episode that doesn't quite make sense all the way through, but has some very memorable visuals that really stuck with me over the years. Cody, played by Jewel State, best known as Kaylee on Firefly, is an artist, but is having trouble finding proper inspiration. She is drawn to the Hunter's Gallery, where she meets the stern, eccentric Mrs. Breyer, who offers to give her art lessons. Mrs. Breyer has a large collection of unfinished paintings, and Cody's first assignment is to finish one, a painting of a ballet dance. She must use a single special brush when painting as well. In classic Are You Afraid of the Dark fashion, it's all a bizarre trap, and when Mrs. Breyer's students finish the paintings, they are trapped inside them, with their souls trapped in the brushes. Their faces are displayed on the paintings. Actually, come to think of it, it's not clear if they're trapped in the paintings or the brushes, or if their soul is split in two, or their consciousness is in the paintings and their soul is in the brush. I don't know. All of this is done to serve Breyer's master, a strange, living shrunken head in her closet known as the Hunter. Yeah, it's a weird episode. This kind of plot was done quite a bit over the course of Are You Afraid of the Dark, but like I said, it's the episode's surreal imagery that earned it a place in this list. The cackling shrunken head, of course, is the true highlight, but there's more than just him. The dream vision Cody has of one of Briar's victims warning her to stay away is nice, and the supernatural ballet recital Cody finds herself trapped in is also great. I think the two most memorable moments for me as a kid involve the trapped victims. When Cody touches some of the cursed paintbrushes, we see quick cuts of the souls within, most of them screaming. Then, when the souls are finally freed, we see the paintings that once housed them have lost their faces. Despite this representing a good thing, the sight of those faceless paintings really sent a shiver down my spine as a youngin'. Very uncanny valley. Number 22. The Quiet Librarian. Silence can be a spooky thing. Just the lack of others around, the feeling of isolation, it can be really creepy to experience. Old buildings can also be creepy, especially empty ones after dark, and this episode was able to combine these fears to make a great story. Lori and Jace are partners for a school project, and neither one is happy about it. Lori is something of a bossy stick in the mud, while Jace is too careless for his own good. When Jace leaves an important notebook at the library, the two have to sneak in after hours to retrieve it. The library seems to have changed, though, and is now a past version of itself, devoid of any new technology. Oh, and there's a ghost. Of course. The ghost, the titular Quiet Librarian, is obsessed with the joy of silence, and stalks the kids, attempting to permanently take their voices away. After that, they'll be confined to the reading room, with the ghosts of her previous victims, who all have to sit and read old books for all eternity. As great as reading is, being trapped away from your family and friends forever is a poor trade. I doubt there's much variety to these books anyway. I think even that poor guy Burgess Meredith played from The Twilight Zone would hate this. Libraries in general can be creepy. When I was a kid, I was very interested in the paranormal, and in fairness I still am, but my hometown's library kept its non-fiction books about ghosts in a rather secluded corner. Venturing back there when I was younger was like a mini-adventure for me. Now, the library has been totally remodeled and improved. No more nerdy children will have to fear that creepy corner if they want to get their paranormal fix. What I'm trying to say is, this episode definitely hit close to home for me. The Quiet Librarian is a merciless villain. All her victims appear to be children, and the image of cobweb-covered ghosts silently screaming is still disturbing. The sad creepiness outweighs the, "oh no, their eternal punishment is reading" joke that you could easily make otherwise. Lori and Jace are also pretty appealing protagonists. I like those stories where you get to see the characters bond over time and become friends by the end. This is an episode where everything falls into place. Unlike some entries on this list, the Gruesome Gourmets comes to mind, this is not one where I have to tell you to proceed with caution. I think most people will enjoy this. Number 21. The Shiny Red Bicycle. This episode almost comes off as an oddity, since unlike a lot of other entries, it takes itself very seriously. And not even in a way that can be seen as hokey by the audience. It succeeds in being very sincere. We get another prologue with the child dying in this one. Ricky and Mike are out on a bike ride on an old bridge when Ricky falls off into the waters below. Despite Mike's best efforts, he is unable to save his friend. The trauma of seeing his best friend die and feeling responsible for it has naturally followed Mike afterwards, and as a teen he begins to see the old bicycle popping up along with the ghost of Ricky. It's affecting him to the point where his parents and teachers are noticing, and what they assume to be guilt-ridden hallucinations are actually taken seriously. A lot of these stories have the adult characters being indifferent, ineffective, or downright negligent, but it's nice to see the authority figures actually being concerned and doing the best they can to help. But of course, it's ultimately Mike who has to solve the problem himself. He believes that Ricky is coming back for revenge, but it turns out that Ricky never blamed Mike, and is here because Mike's little brother Ben is in trouble. As you can guess, this is a more somber episode that deals with guilt and grief. The scenes where Ricky and later Ben are in trouble are still upsetting to watch, and have probably stuck with a lot of people who saw this as kids. I know they did for me. For once, the ghost isn't the scary part. I said this about Quicksilver, and I'll say it again. I really like the relationship between the brothers. It's nice to see that they really care about each other. In Goosebumps, the siblings were generally kind of awful to each other, with certain characters like the little sister from the Cuckoo Clock of Doom coming off as downright sociopaths. I read and watched Goosebumps religiously back then, and I still have a huge soft spot for that series, but today I admire these siblings, who act more like real people rather than caricatures. Continuing to point out voice actors from our childhoods, The boy's father is played by Mark Camacho, who is Francine's father on Arthur, the world's coolest garbage man. We have 2 cartoon grandmothers in this episode too. The teacher is played by Joanna Noyes, who is Grandma Thora on Arthur, and the boy's mother is played by Pauline Little, who is Caillou's grandma. If you're in the mood for something a little more serious, definitely watch The Shiny Red Bicycle. This episode will still manage to tug at your heartstrings. That wraps up part 1. I think in the next 2 parts we'll get to the real meat of things. I wanted to do a top 31 list for the month of October, and although I had fun talking about this batch, these are the episodes that would have maybe been in the honorable mentions had I done a top 20 list or something instead. I hope you enjoyed this first part, and I hope you'll join me for the next 2 installments as we continue to look at these Are You Afraid of the Dark highlights.